Hi, my name's Debs Hollingsworth and I'm a SENDCo. I've recently been hosting a series of events in my local area that are called Ask A SENDCo. I set this up really primarily because sometimes when I tell people that I am a SENDCo, a lot of people have questions. 17% of the children in England's schools are registered as having special educational needs and disabilities. So that is a lot of people navigating systems, and it's not always easy to get clear advice. So here I am. I'm about to video narrate a presentation that I gave on the evening, and this is the third in a series of three in the first instance, and um, and I hope that some people find it useful. So what you'll see on the screen now is the layout, the format of what the evening looked like when I hosted the local events. We had a free tea and coffee, meet your host, I introduced myself, and then we had the presentation. This presentation is about diagnostic pathways and decisions, particularly around dyslexia, ADHD and autism. It is relevant to everyone nationally, but there are some pieces of information that are particular to Waltham Forest, which is where I live and where I hosted the event. Then on the evening we had a little break and I then hosted a question and answer session because it is complex, and I'm sure anyone who's watching this, if you're actually got decisions to make or if you're into that process, then you probably have got questions. If you want to get in touch with me, you can see my email address on the screen now, and if you want to get in touch, if you want to ask me a question, I'll try my best to answer. Okay, so when we're considering diagnostic decisions and pathways, we have to start really with a little overview on neurodiversity. First of all, the frequency of occurrence. It's currently estimated that 1 in 7 people in England are neurodivergent. That is 15% of the population, or in real terms, 10 to 14 million people. Diagnosis is on the increase, but I suppose the jury is still out really on whether that means that there is an increasing frequency of occurrence or whether we're just better at diagnosis. I tend to believe that we are seeing a more frequent occurrence, but other people would disagree. So that's a discussion for another day. A little note on semantics, which always fascinate me. Neurodiversity is used when we're talking about a group of people or conditions. Neurodivergent is used when we are talking about an individual. Neurological conditions are those that are, so the definition for neurological is that it is of or relating to the brain and nervous system. That means that the conditions are starting in the brain or operating within the brain, but they are having impact which via the nervous system will result in physical manifestations, which might be the behaviours, the presentations, or the processing, etc. So it is both brain and body. And the neurodivergent umbrella is absolutely huge, and it has a range of conditions. There is ADHD, autism, dyscalculia, dyslexia, developmental coordination disorder, which used to be called dyspraxia, but that's on the way out, epilepsy, Tourette syndrome, Down syndrome, and a huge range of others. And not only that, but there are new conditions being discovered or identified or labelled and named regularly. It's a real challenge to keep up. Sensory processing disorder, bipolar, I think that used to be called manic depression, OCD, PDA, pathological demand avoidance, OCD, sorry, that's obsessive compulsive disorder. And there are, and language goes with, it also develops. There is a high comorbidity between the conditions. So if you have a neurodivergent condition, you are highly likely, not high, but I think it's about 70% the comorbidity. And so you are very likely to be identified as having another. And so, for example, there is a new phrase which I'm seeing and hearing more increasingly often, which is ADHD, spelled AUDHD, because of the very high frequency of comorbidity between autism and ADHD. So AUDHD means that you have been diagnosed with, or one has been diagnosed with, both of those conditions. If we start to talk and think then about diagnosis, neurodivergent conditions are diagnosed by a means of combination of both psychometric tests of social competence, attainment and ability. So you are looking at attainment, but it's not only that, it is also observational and presentational analysis. In fact, in some cases, there is no psychometric testing that take place. It might all relate to the observational and presentational analysis. For children in education, the nurseries and schools must be involved in the diagnostic journey of children. You can go to see your GP if you're seeking a diagnosis for your child. If you have concerns, by all means, you can go and see your GP, but most commonly they will refer you back to the school SENDCo. If you go to see the GP and they decide to take forward a diagnosis, the clinical consultants will nonetheless contact schools. Schools must complete the relevant survey or assessment independently from and as well as parents. So what that means is that if a clinician is seeking a diagnosis because they don't know the child, they will send the documents relating to observations and presentations and attainment to the school SENDCo, and we will be expected to then give information regarding the presentations that we see in school. Parents or carers will also complete the same or very similar forms, because it is very well known that the presentations of a child with a neurodivergent condition may differ significantly between home and school, and so it is important that we look holistically at the whole child. They are obviously more than likely to feel much more comfortable at home, much more comfortable with their primary carers, and therefore they might behave in a different way, which can be both a blessing or a challenge for those people who are home carers, depending, as I say, on the child. Ages for diagnosis. It is unusual for a child under the age of 2 to receive a diagnosis. Autism may be ascertained early if there are very significant presentations. So healthcare providers, healthcare professionals, and education providers may refer a child for the checklist of autism in toddlers, the CHAT, between 18 and 24 months. In most instances, realistically, it's a little bit later than that, and also we are, of course, which we'll come to in a little while, looking at very significant waiting lists. So the occurrence of children with a diagnosis before the age of 2 is rare. ADHD is not usually diagnosed before the age of 6. In fact, I would say in many instances, in many local authorities, ADHD referrals are not accepted before the age of 6, and that is because some of the presentations can be just quite high energy and childish. So a child who might be running around and displaying certain behaviours in their nursery or at their home may settle as they develop, and also it's very difficult for clinicians and doctors really below the age of 6 to developmentally assess that child's behaviours and their mannerisms, etc. We ask a lot of our children these days in schools, so actually many children by the age of 4 and 5 are following a fairly academic curriculum, so we might actually see those presentations a little bit sooner, but nonetheless I think it's reasonable that actually we don't diagnose until the age of 6. And diagnostic assessments for dyslexia are generally carried out from the age of 7, and again the reason for that is part of the diagnosis process, not exclusively but part of it with dyslexia does involve a assessment of a child's interactions with the written word and abilities to articulate visually as well as what they're seeing and what they're saying, and therefore it does make sense that that diagnosis doesn't really take place until age 7. So dyslexia. Dyslexia is classified as a specific learning difficulty. SPLD. SPLDs affect the way information is learned and processed. They are neurological, of the brain and of the nervous system, rather than psychological, of the mind. As with other neurodivergent conditions, they can be genetic and family histories can be identified in many cases, not all. Specific learning difficulties occur independently of intelligence. So dyslexia is a learning difficulty. It is a barrier to accessing the curriculum or the learning environment. It is not a learning disability, which means that you have are likely to have a lifelong condition impacting on your ability to learn, or your IQ as it is traditionally measured. Dyslexia can have a significant impact on education and learning, on organisation, and on the acquisition of literacy skills. Other specific learning difficulties are ADHD, developmental coordination disorder, which used to be referred to as dyspraxia, but I don't think that is what the term we use anymore. We say DCD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and dyslexia. So some symptoms, some, not all, of the symptoms, and this is, I don't like to generalise because conditions are as many and various as the wonderful individual children that we work with, but some common symptoms of dyslexia are difficulty following instructions, forgetful with words, or unable to recognise words that are familiar to them. Stronger oral skills than written skills, so better at articulating ideas and very better in conversation than trying to write it down. Poor comprehension skills, again particularly with written work. Disorganisation, confusing letters and words, confusing right and left, difficulty processing information and requiring additional processing time. So let's talk about the diagnosis of dyslexia. The true fact at this day and age is that most schools no longer pay for dyslexia assessments unless the presentations are really severely impacting access to education or life skills. The reason for this is that dyslexia is, I believe, currently the most commonly occurring specific learning difficulty. In fact, I believe it's the most commonly occurring neurodivergent condition. It is estimated that 1 in 10 people have dyslexia, and that 4% of people with dyslexia find that it severely impacts their life and their ability to access education. So as a SENCo, it's only really in that 4% of dyslexics where I would actually say, do you know what, I'm going to access an actual diagnosis. I'm going to try and get a diagnosis. We often use online screeners. If a parent, a family or a teacher raises with us the fact that they believe that a child is presenting with dyslexic tendencies, then we may well try to use, in the first instance, an online screener that give a general indication about the likelihood of dyslexia being present. What this is really is a online computer program. There are, I believe, 5 areas for most of them: visual processing, and I'd have to look up exactly what they are, but you do the tests tend to last between 20 minutes and 40 minutes online. Child sits at the computer screen, responds to instructions which are auditory, and then at the end a computer generated report says, well, actually here are the child's responses, here are their response times, this is where they sit in the national cohort, and these are the indications of whether a child may have dyslexia. Children without a diagnosis may still qualify for access arrangements in the leading up to SATs and GCSEs. It's easier to get access arrangements at the level of SATs because it's year 6 and schools can do that in-house. They can provide evidence and run little diagnostic assessments. At GCSEs, you do have to have a qualified access arrangement assessor to say that a child needs additional time, or a scribe or a reader for their exams, even without an actual diagnosis of dyslexia. The reason that we don't these days go for diagnosis very often is because, apart from anything else, they're very, very expensive. So private diagnoses for dyslexia are conducted by specialist teachers or psychologists. You cannot access a dyslexia diagnosis via the NHS. It doesn't exist. The psychologists or specialist teachers must be suitably qualified in order to perform and interpret the relevant assessments. It is usually, but not always, slightly cheaper to have a specialist teacher conduct the dyslexia assessment rather than a fully qualified psychologist. But in either case, costs are likely to be somewhere in between £350 and £600. I have seen them more expensive than that. I haven't yet encountered them less expensive than that. And for that reason, as well as and how commonly occurring it is as a condition, diagnosis is rarely sought. However, for some people, dyslexia can have a very, very significant impact on their ability to access the curriculum, organise themselves, access the written word, read it to a functional level. And in those cases, I would expect a school to seek a diagnosis. Otherwise, parents can do it, but it is, be warned, a bit of an expensive process. In terms of my local area, Waltham Forest, there is the Waltham Forest Dyslexia Association, and I gave them a ring and I had a quick chat through with them. They offer a screening service and a report, and that costs around £50. So that's the screener though, that is not a diagnosis. And they do not, actually at Waltham Forest, they do not, the Waltham Forest Dyslexia Association do not currently offer the full dyslexia assessments. However, they have a wealth of information. They do have, I believe they're currently still offering clubs and drop-ins. They used to run touch typing clubs. I'm not sure if they're still doing that, but touch typing is highly recommended for children with dyslexia, and there's some excellent online programs now. I personally use touch type read and spell. And there is the British Dyslexia Association, and they offer a database of qualified assessors, and they will give you some guidance towards professional practitioners. So if you are thinking of seeking a private diagnosis for dyslexia, please do check in with the British Dyslexia Association to make sure that your practitioner is actually qualified and registered. So even though I'm mostly focusing on the kind of diagnosis, decisions and pathways, obviously I am a SENDCo, so one of the key questions is, well, what support can I expect if my child has dyslexia or has presentations that suggest dyslexia? And there's no getting away from the fact that this is going to be hugely different from school to school, from teacher to teacher. It depends on the curriculum. It depends on the funding, the knowledge and skills of the teachers, the teaching assistants, the SENDCo, the investment of time and resources of senior leaders. So there's not a single answer to this. If your child has dyslexia, then definitely well worth, or you suspect your child has dyslexia, well worth asking the school SENDCo what support is available. It can be also with the curriculum as we have it now in England, it's very busy. There's a lot of expectations, and so because of pace and because of planning, it can be quite difficult to offer the additional processing time and support that sometimes I think children with dyslexia would or do benefit from. Nonetheless, some schools manage it exceptionally well, and most schools are making a pretty good effort. And also because it is so common, there is a lot of use of strategies that are supportive. So I'm going to run a few of the things that you could be expecting or looking for, things that might benefit a child who has dyslexia. First of all, the biggie, I suppose, is alternatives to writing. Many ways that can be achieved. It can be allowing a child and encouraging a child, teaching a child to do bullet pointing or mind mapping, allowing a child not to have to write using their best writing on a line. Say, actually, do you know what? Just put the words all over your page. Listen for the keywords and get those down, however it best suits you. Handouts that contain the key learning points rather than copying from the board. I think a key thing is to remove the amount of copying from the board required is definitely going to be helpful and should be expected in any setting, really. So switched on teachers or schools might give handouts. Often knowledge organisers do the job, or and then from the handouts, then you can use highlighters and that sort of thing. So repeating instructions or information and checking for the understanding of instructions and information. Visual timetables, colour coding and symbols. There might be alternative formatting options used on screens or on whiteboards. Uncluttered worksheets or whiteboards. I mean, this is really very common now. When I started teaching, my cat's just bothering me, sorry. When I started teaching, I know that I would make my worksheets really full of, I want a picture there and I want 8 different fonts and I want, colours, and actually there is a general move towards a much more streamlined visual presentation of information and data now. Boxes that have the key vocabulary to start and images that are directly linked and relevant next to the text that they're describing, and that is pretty standard now. Avoid justification and avoid underlining in typed texts. These are a big no-no for the dyslexic brain. If you have that very neat edge down the side of text, then actually it makes one line it can make, I should say, one line of text indecipherable from the next, so it's much more difficult to follow down. And underlining, of course, actually changes the shape of letters. So peer support, particularly to record homework tasks. So actually asking, hey, buddy up and get your peer to write in your homework planner. If schools are still using homework planners, because obviously we all used to. And the teacher often used to say at the end of the lesson, right, now everybody quick write that in your planner. And our dyslexic students were like, as soon as you say quick write that, then it's over. So there is assistive technology such as reading pens and also touch typing. If you are a parent of a child with dyslexia, there is not a lot of research, because actually there isn't a lot of research, especially peer reviewed and all evidence-based studies, but there is research that shows that touch typing can be extremely effective and in increasing typing speed and increasing the connections in the brain between the look of the letter, and it's multisensory. So touch typing, I personally use a program or recommend a program that is called Touch Type Read and Spell, TTRS, which I think is really, really good. But if you are going to teach, if you're going to encourage a child to learn touch typing, they must be committed for doing it just like 15 minutes 3 times a week. But you have to get an investment of time. So that might happen at school, it can happen at home, but as I say, it has to become a really routine practice, because you're not going to achieve that if you're doing it once a week. So use of multisensory teaching strategies and resources, additional processing time, chunking information, sentence starters, writing frames, gap fills, and exam access arrangements. So that might be a reader, a scribe, additional time. I think that is the majority of it. I'm sure I've missed things because there's other things that people are doing. Teachers do try their best to make adjustments for our dyslexic students. And in fact, there is an increasing acknowledgement that if it's helpful for children with dyslexia, it's helpful for many learners in the class. Moving on to ADHD, that's Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. As I said earlier, always interested in semantics. I believe that in time we will see that the D in that diagnosis changes, because I think the word disorder may well die a death in due course. It's already on the way out for autism, which is now more commonly autism or autism spectrum condition rather than disorder, and I think the same should be true of ADHD. The problem, of course, is that the acronym is so well known, it's perhaps more difficult to replace, but we'll see. ADHD is a neurological condition affecting behaviour, interactions and responses. Diagnosis can take place in England from age 6. In many places, the referrals are only accepted from age 6. The current waiting time nationally varies from place to place, borough to borough, local authority to local authority. It's regularly over a year. I gave CAMHS in Waltham Forest a ring to discuss their current waiting times. I'm based in Waltham Forest, and they claimed that their current waiting time is between 6 months and a year. However, I think in reality, in Waltham Forest and many other areas, you can expect to wait in excess of a year. Referral is most usually via CAMHS, although it can be other clinical teams. They might have different names. They might not come under the CAMHS umbrella. And CAMS, by the way, is Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, just in case you didn't know that. And there is an increasing frequency of private companies offering diagnostic routes and pathways. Please exercise caution if you are going to be using one of these, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that and why that you should take care with that in a little while. So what are some of the symptoms? What might you recognise in your child that might lead you to believe that your child has ADHD? Again, it is a spectrum condition, so you would not likely to, you might not see all of these, you might see only some of these, and I don't want to oversimplify, but nonetheless, some of the symptoms include impulsivity, lack of risk awareness, hyperactivity, hyperfixation. That means getting really into a task to the point that you can exclude all else that's going on around you, really showing a total focus on a particular preferred interest. Inattentiveness, emotional dysregulation, being disorganized or careless, excessive physical movement, tics and twitches and constant fidgeting, talking too much, interrupting, non-sequential speech, overwhelm, potentially at what is often things that are often considered simple tasks. I mean, a classic example really is tidying the bedroom. Very messy bedroom might be not just because the child likes mess or is messy, but because they simply cannot get their brain to structure the tidy up process as a neurotypical person might. And difficulties with task initiation or task completion. Presentations do vary significantly from one individual to another, and there are kind of common or generalized differences between girls and boys, although I am aware of the fact that there is gender sensitivities, and I'm not seeking to stereotype, but we can't get away from it. Current diagnosis is 3 times more likely in males, in boys. They also tend to be diagnosed younger. They might have more frequent and more notable physical symptoms, whereas girls do, as a generalisation, tend to have more internalised and more inattentive symptoms. So I particularly like this this graphic, which has come from Neurodiversity Insights, and I thought it really helps to clarify about the different types of ADHD, because there is an inattentive type ADHD, a hyperactive type ADHD, and the ADHD combined, where you see a fairly equal mix of the presentations from each. I don't intend to read through this. You can pause the screen if you want to have a look, but that inattentive is really about being distracted, forgetful, disorganized, troubles focusing on listening, troubles processing, being a bit forgetful, whereas the hyperactivity can be impulsive, physically active, overactive, on the go, restless, and inattentive type ADHD tends to be diagnosed later, because the manifestation, the presentation of the hyperactive individuals or presentations characteristics are more obvious, they're more evident. So again, just to run through some of the support you might expect for a child who has ADHD within a school environment. I think probably the most commonly implemented Strategy is brain breaks. That is giving, focus followed by release, focus followed by release. And that might be, the release might be inside of the classroom, a little fidget or a little movement, or it might be a more significant movement break. In fact, one school I visited had an exercise bike. It was a secondary school, and they had an exercise bike undercover just outside, and they had a number of children who, if they felt they really needed a brain boost, because there's a lot of information around exercise and the power of exercise in helping with focus, and so the children would go down to a minute or 3 minutes of high power on the bike, then slowly breathing, walking back to lesson, back to focus. Anyway, that would be a brain break, but that's an extreme and I thought rather wonderful example. There's lots of other ways that we can put in place brain breaks. Visuals, so that is visual timetables, now next boards or now next then boards, task maps. I heard a new term for that the other day and I can't remember what it was, so I'll have to come back to that. Tick lists, tactile and concrete resources. So visuals that really help to break down tasks are really, really helpful for children who have ADHD, and again can be applied at home. Jigs, that was the word, jigs. Look it up. Jigs are sort of visual task sheets and very helpful, allowing for backward chaining. Another relatively new phrase I've learned or really come to understand. I've heard backward chaining for years, but it's only now that I really go, I get it, yeah. Anyway, sentence starters, scaffolded writing support, chunking information and instruction. Again, going back to the task initiation. Task initiation can be very difficult for a child with ADHD. So to say, right, actually, now you're going to do this, and to help you, here is that. Here you're going to do this. So here are your first 3 words. Sentence starters can be very helpful. Use of name before direct communication. This is a very simple but very effective strategy for children with ADHD and autism, because actually if you've got what I like to call a very busy brain, you might not really be focused on what the teacher's saying, and you might not recognise it is actually for you. So if there is going to be direct communication, you just say the child's name first and wait until they're obviously listening. Explicit praise and instruction. So again, it's another very simple and easy to implement strategy. You say name, well done for that, and now you're going to do that. And so, it can, and with that very simple, it's a verbal prompt on what to do next. And also it builds self-esteem by saying, well done, oh, well done, Bobby, well done, you've copied the date, and now you're going to write your first sentence. There's your sentence starter, and it just keeps the child on track. Minimizing distractions, so a calm learning environment, structure, routine. It's not always possible, but having there are aids that are used to help, particularly at primary school. You might have a workstation or desk dividers, so you can actually ear defenders. That might come up in a minute. So resources including timers, so that actually we can see how long we've got to do tasks. Wobble cushions, so sitting, so that you're sitting and you can keep your movement going. There are also I think they're called yoga bands actually, but there are bands that you can put between the front legs of a chair, so that while a child is sitting, they can be bouncing their leg. It's not distracting for the people in the class, but allows them that stimulation and that movement. Desk dividers, so that actually we're doing a focused written task for 15 minutes. You put your desk divider, here's your timer, and actually the child can get into their zone. Ear defenders to help block out all the many noises and distractions, especially because children with ADHD can be particularly susceptible to noise and distraction, and noise can be interpreted. Sensory processing can be a bit different, so noise that perhaps we wouldn't necessarily pick up on might be very prominent for them. Concentration aids. This is another word for fidget toys, but I do prefer the phrase concentration aids. I personally have a rule that these should be one-handed under the table in a pocket or outside the classroom, because what you don't want is a load of fidget toys on the desks. You also, of course, might get teaching assistant support. That can be in class, that can be for brain breaks, that can be reminders, and it can be for relationship building, which is very important, and building up an understanding of the individual, and for emotional regulation so that the child knows who they can talk to when they're feeling anxious, etc. You also might have support from external professionals, including follow-up from CAMS, particularly if medication is involved, and follow-up from educational psychologists if the presentations are, significantly impacting. Some children have ADHD that they find very impactful in the learning environment and at home, and in that case you might be exploring medication, and if you do, that can be quite a journey to get it right. And you might need, as I say, so you might need follow-up from CAMS, clinicians and educational psychologists in terms of adapting learning environments and putting in place the correct strategies. But many children with ADHD do not have this. They have little reasonable adjustments as detailed here in order to ensure that they are able to access the curriculum in the classroom. If you're thinking about exploring a diagnosis of ADHD, so pre-diagnosis, I would urge you to just think about whether your child has had or has got adverse childhood experiences in their history. Presentations of ADHD can often be similar to those of children who have trauma or attachment issues stemming from ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. In some instances, assessment for ADHD is declined if the child is known to have suffered ACEs, particularly in the recent past. So actually I have had a child where I referred for a diagnosis, but there was known trauma that had been experienced recently, and the clinicians said they would like to have let a period of a year pass before accepting a re-referral. Not sure I agreed with that one, but I do understand that actually some children who, for example, children who've been in care, children who have lived with families who have substance abuse, etc., might be presenting with some of the similar symptoms, but actually it's to do with nurture and trauma. That's because toxic stress affects the minds and bodies of children. And so the difference, I suppose, is that if a child has ADHD, it is a lifelong condition. Whereas if a child has had adverse childhood experiences, actually, if the provision of a safe, stable, nurturing environment and strong relationships can help children to build skills around social emotional resilience and to settle, to calm and to develop towards a sort of more stable adulthood. So autism. Autism is a lifelong learning disability, not a difficulty. It is classified as a learning disability. It affects the way in which individuals communicate, understand and engage with the world and the people around them. It is a spectrum condition. Actually, all of these neurodivergent conditions I'm discussing today are spectrum conditions, but I suppose that one is very much associated with autism, that phrase. Autism spectrum, it used to be autism spectrum disorder, more frequently now autism spectrum condition or autism. It is neurological. It affects the brain and the nervous system. And that spectrum condition means that there are very, very many different ways that it can present, that it can impact, and that it can affect an individual's life and processing. We used to say when I was at school, I love this question, if I say to you, how many senses do we have? The vast majority of adults will say 5 senses. However, that has now been that's now well outdated. 9, I think, 9 regularly referred to. Actually, some specialists would argue that there are 27 or more different senses and that more are being discovered all the time. I've put on here a visual that has come from Matt Lowry or mattlowrylpp.com. And I just really like it because it's got some of the experiences that children or people with autism might have. So I'm not going to go through it, but actually you start to see there some of the new senses that we're starting to recognise: proprioception, interoception, although that's not all senses, that's presentations. But so I don't want to oversimplify or overgeneralize, but some of the symptoms or presentations or experiences of children and people with autism might be social communication difficulties, sensory sensitivities, and that can be with many things: light, sound, touch, taste, smell, also their own internal working. So actually the feeling of cold, the feeling of hunger, where we get pins and needles, for example. A child with autism might find that absolutely intolerable. Emotional regulation difficulties, that's frequent behaviours that other people might find challenging, so the people around them might find challenging. Meltdowns, shutdowns, anxieties, and of course having these emotional regulation difficulties, people around us around the child might find that challenging to manage or help with, and of course sometimes it can be deeply unpleasant for the child involved. Repetitive or restrictive behaviours and special interests. If you feel that your child may have autism, I've put there a couple of links or resources that I would recommend. I would recommend you have a look at the National Autistic Society website and the Autism Education Trust website. Both of these are fantastic resources with a whole wealth of information and videos and, so much help. And I'm not even going to sort of try and say what support might be expected for a child within school, because it does really depend enormously on the child. Some of that support that I put for the previous for ADHD would be also advantageous for children with autism, but it's such a vastly individual condition that I think that there's almost too much to cover. We're starting to think about diagnostic decision making. If you start to believe that your child is presenting, or if the school tells you they believe that child is presenting with traits commonly associated with a neurodivergent condition such as ADHD or autism, there can be a big period of time when it's, you think about, well, do I seek a diagnosis? You also have children where it becomes evident over time in their teenage years, etc., that you start to think, well, actually, that they haven't developed this skill or that skill. Is it possible that there's an underlying reason for that? Do I seek diagnosis? It is entirely a decision for families to make. However, many people in adolescence or in early adulthood and beyond do feel a greater sense of identity, self-identity, self-understanding, in knowing and really getting to grips with and processing in a personalised form a diagnosis. So if you do have special interests or repetitive behaviours or sensory sensitivities, then it might impact the way that you interact with others and interact with the world. And if you understand the why you are like that, then it can, I would suggest, be helpful. Increasingly of my generation, many people got that diagnosis late or have self kind of diagnosed later and ongoing, hang on, I think, I suspect. I am a great advocate of saying, yes, rule it in or rule it out. It helps people to know themselves. It used to be, and it still is, some people are very concerned about labelling or stigmatising, etc. But we're living in an age now where we really are getting a much greater understanding of all of these conditions. And so I just feel that that stigma really is no longer a major consideration. 17% of our children are on the SEND register, and as we said at the beginning of this presentation, 1 in 7 are believed to be neurodivergent. So actually what it can help with is an understanding of self, which can be very helpful. Important little aside, diagnostic pathways are offered where the GP is based, not where the school is, not where the family lives, where the GP is based. If possible, it's great to be able to centralise that, have school, GP and home all within the same local authority to start the process. It means that if you need to access follow-up services, or if a transition from school to school takes place, then it can just be a little bit smoother. However, that's not always possible, so just be aware that if your GP is not in the same local authority as the home and the school, let the SENCo know. In terms of my local area, Waltham Forest, the pathways are via CAMS for autism and for ADHD. As we've mentioned earlier, dyslexia there is no NHS pathway. So, however, for example, I work in Haringey, and in Haringey it is 2 separate services. There is the Social Communication and Autism Diagnostic Service, SCADS, and the ADHD referral is via CAMS. So, you know, you have to look in your local area, but certainly for Waltham Forest, it is actually a single referral form, and but you need different accompanying documents. For ADHD nationally, it's either the Connors or the SNAP. They're very similar. And in Waltham Forest, it's the SNAP form, and that has a series of questions regarding observations and behaviours that is completed by both parents and school and submitted with the referral forms. For autism, it is the Childhood Autism Spectrum Test, CAST, or the Childhood Autism Test for toddlers, which I've forgotten, I've said that wrong, but if your child is very young, pre-age 2, then it is the CHAT, and again that goes via CAMS. In Waltham Forest, which will be a reflection of what's going on nationally, but there are regional differences, but in Waltham Forest the current wait times, they claim, are ADHD 6 months to a year and autism 18 months to 2 years. So do be aware. Also, your SENCo has to be involved. You have to get the school to assist in the observational forms that you have to submit. So please also be aware that some SENCos, myself included, many of us, we deal now with a lot of external professionals and a lot of referrals, a lot of requests. And so we might also have a waiting list. If a child is brought to my attention, it's going to take me a few months until their name reaches the top of the list, ready for me to do all the processing that is required, because it's a process that takes many hours. So just if you decide to follow a diagnostic pathway, great. I think it's the right thing to do, but you do have to be patient. A little note on private diagnosis. The private diagnosis of autism exists. It does exist, but it's far less common than ADHD. One of the possible reasons for this, I believe it to be a reason, is that for autism, there is no medication prescribed. If a child has a diagnosis of autism, then the managing of that condition is to do with adjustments and understanding and patience and strategies. It is not to do with medication, although some medications might later be prescribed for sleep or anxiety, etc. But there is not a medication associated with autism. And it is possible, therefore, that the private companies haven't kind of launched into that diagnosis because sadly, I have to say, there is less profit associated. There's no profit in medication and therefore no ongoing sort of repeat prescription profit in the private diagnosis of autism. But private diagnoses are available if you decide to seek that because you do not want to be caught up in the many long years of waiting on the NHS. Then you can expect to pay in excess of £1,000. With ADHD, there is a rapid growth in private clinics offering ADHD assessments. The initial assessment costs are anywhere from £450 upwards, but in my experience it's upwards. They should abide by NICE guidelines. NICE guidelines, I think. Something Institute of Clinical Excellence guidelines, but in practice many do not, and it can be difficult to ascertain. I recently wanted to try and find out about a company who were offering a private diagnosis, and I really couldn't get the information very easily. Also, they're using all sorts of tricks. So for example, they'll have a clinician, qualified clinician, giving their name to it, but actually the assessment is taking place by somebody who is not a qualified psychologist or clinician. So I'm concerned about the growth in the private diagnosis of ADHD. Please be aware that if you have a private diagnosis of ADHD which is accompanied by a prescription for medication, then it is unlikely to be honoured by your GP. That means that if you get a prescription for medication, the company is likely to offer to courier you the medication you require. They'll prescribe it and they'll supply it. You'll pay for it. I have experience of people paying over £100 a month for medication for children as young as 6 following a private diagnosis. The GP is not going to offer that prescription unless the child has an NHS diagnosis. So even though you can get a private diagnosis and that might lead to private prescription of medication, actually when you then go to the GP says, no, you have to get an NHS diagnosis, and then you're back into those same systems and waiting lists, and it can result in really being caught up in quite slow and quite I think it's really it can be really, really challenging. It can be a real sad sort of situation that you're trying to support parents with, really. So please do be cautious. Although, again, as with all of these things, there are other professionals, including SENDCos, who have a different experience from me and who would be all for and very pro the private diagnosis because it happens a lot more quickly than the NHS. Okay, final thing for me is a little bit about some recommended reading. First of all, you've got the Can I Tell You About series. These are fantastic little books for children aged 7+, but I have used them with teenagers. I used to have them in my office. I had a kid who was left in my office, picked up a book, Can I Tell You About ADHD, read it, sat there and said to me, Miss, this is me, it's describing me. And for me, it was such a light bulb moment because I was really pleased because, yes, he did have ADHD and we did do the referral and get a diagnosis. So anyway, they're really, really good books. I recommend them for parents and teachers and everyone. And there's a whole range of those. There are 2 books that absolutely changed my life. One of them, The Reason I Jump, is written by Naoko Higashida. I probably said that wrong and I apologise, but it's a brilliant book about a child who was totally underestimated and and then actually when it was discovered, he discovered how he could write, and he's written this book and another book and does speeches around the world, etc. And that's to do with an autism diagnosis. I Can Write has nothing to do with autism, ADHD or dyslexia, but it is absolutely brilliant book by Jonathan Bryan, and it is another case of a child who was not able to find his own voice until years it was written off as you know, a child with very significant learning needs, which was found not to be the case, and it's just perfectly brilliant. Those two books combined literally dictated my career path, so really recommended. I've worked with a number of teenage girls, and therefore I've got a couple of books on there that I recommend for teenage girls. I'm afraid I don't have the same recommendations for teenage boys. There you go. And for any children, sorry, parents of children who suspect they might have ADHD, or or that the child is just actually quite disorganized, I really recommend these two books, Smart But Scattered and Smart But Scattered Teens. Really good. It's got diagnostic sort of checklist in there. From that, it builds upon strategies that you can use in your home. I really recommend it. And then also, of course, there's a whole range of resources available online now. So you can get your questions answered in many ways, and you can also reach out to me using that email address that is on the screen, info@sendexpertise.co.uk. If you got this far in my presentation, I thank you very much. I'm really pleased. Hope it's been helpful, and I'm, as I say, I'm Debs Hollingsworth, and I made this presentation just in the hopes that I could help a few people, nothing more than that. So if you have watched this far, thanks very much. That's all.